Hello and welcome to storytelling. He kept feeling the same thing over and over, a brilliant burst of light, intense pain, and finally darkness. He occasionally heard voices, but he was unable to identify the source or understand the words. Attempting to speak, he was unable. He struggled to get up but couldn't. But the light was different this time. It was as if he was looking through a fog with no clarity and no ability to concentrate. Before him, shadowy figures moved, and he attempted to cry out but was unsuccessful. He started to hear sounds, but they were all meaningless. Despite his best efforts, he was unable to move. When he tried to scream, nothing came out. He paused to rest, exhausted, and the darkness enveloped him once more. He was unsure of how long it took, but eventually the light came back. Eventually, he forced himself to move, but it required all of his strength. He opened his mouth to yell, but only a sickly gurgle came out. It was as if there was something stuck in his throat, preventing him from speaking. He heard a loud noise as a shadow passed in front of him, stopped, and then ran away. This time, he noticed more shadows approaching and encircling him. He tried to clear his vision by blinking. He couldn't understand what the shadows were doing to him as they moved quickly around him. Then he perceived a voice. The voice said, "Mr. Smith, can you hear me?" He thought, who the hell was Mr. Smith? He tried nodding his head, but he could still hear the man. After much effort, he was able to nod somewhat. When his vision cleared, he saw that he was in a hospital bed and that everyone nearby, dressed in medical attire, was trying desperately to resuscitate him. He heard a man who he assumed to be a doctor talk about trying to get him to breathe on his own. He soon felt like something was being pulled out of his throat and tape was being removed from his face. Panting, he realized all at once that there was nothing in his throat to obstruct it. He tentatively inhaled a few times, enjoying the sensation of breathing in air. With a good, the man spoke. Looking around, he saw several wires running throughout his body, including an 4 placed into his lower arm and a blood pressure cuff on his upper arm. In addition, he could feel the catheter inserted into his penis. Gazing upon the wall, he perceived the thinnest television panel he had ever laid eyes on, and the ticker at the base of the screen conveyed some information about a President Trump. Trump, he questioned. How much time had he spent here? Barack Obama had only been in the White House for a few months when he last knew. He questioned feebly, how long? The physician examined his bulky chart before responding. From what I can tell, about 10 years, Mr. Smith, he replied. 10 years? What the hell happened, and who was this Smith guy they all referred to, was his question. Just relax, Mr. Smith. We're going to check you out and get you set up for rehab, said the physician. The doctor made notes while he watched the nurses remove his arms and legs from the splints keeping him in the bed. He glanced at another nurse and then started talking. Do we have Mr. Smith's contact information available? He inquired. A young nurse gave an affirmative response after checking her computer. The man wondered who would come see him when the nurse started to make calls. Very well, reach out and let them know. Even though his memory was still a little hazy, he was still married and had a daughter who was 8 years old. My God, he pondered. He considered his wife Lydia, thinking, my daughter Jenny would be 18 now and probably ready to go to college. But for some reason, he wasn't quite sure what it was about her that truly disgusted and infuriated him. Well, Mr. Smith, said the physician, your vitals look good, but we're going to run some tests anyway. Once we get those back, we'll get this feeding tube out of you and get you up to your room. You're going to be our guest for a little while, but we'll get you into a rehab facility and get you back on your feet, okay? The man gave a nod. Doctor, who's Smith? He asked. The physician glanced down at his notes, then turned back to face him. Why, you are, he uttered. You've been through a lot, so it's not surprising that you might be experiencing some amnesia. That's okay, we'll get someone in to work with you. Now just relax, and we'll get you set up. The doctor then departed, giving instructions to 2 nurses before he went. The man was aware of his true identity, which was not this Smith persona. Wilson Avery was his name. 1972 saw the birth of this son of Dan and Barbara Wilson. Robert, his brother, was 1 year his senior. Right out of high school, Robert enlisted in the Army at the age of 18, where he received sniper training. He moved around the world for the next 4 years, staying in Kuwait among other trouble spots. After escaping Desert Storm in 1994, he went back to his native Southern California and finished his associate's degree in criminal justice in 1996. He joined the LAP because he had always wanted to be a police officer and to use his military experience there. Upon completing the police academy, he was appointed as a sharpshooter. He first got together with Lydia Jackson in 1997, and the two were hitched in 1999. He believed everything was wonderful, and in October 2000, their daughter Jennifer was born. While his wife practiced law for the same company where his brother was a partner, he continued to serve with the force. After winning a sizable lottery prize in late 2008, his situation deteriorated. It came to him quite by surprise that his wife had been having an affair with his brother for some time around the time he won the lottery. Luckily, Ben Jacobs, his confidant and good friend, had persuaded him to allow him to open an international account in a different name, keeping Lydia from accessing the majority of his lottery winnings. Ben handled the account management for him because he was an expert in money matters. Additionally, he introduced him to a genuine shark of a lawyer who detested infidelity in marriages and despised Robert even more. Ben also installed cameras to monitor Robert and Lydia, and he was able to obtain images and videos of their trysts. He was going to confront his wife about her extramarital affair, but something came up. Even though he was unable to recall every detail of that evening, he was confident that he would soon be able to. 10 years later, the next memory he had was waking up in this hospital ward. Tired, he put his head back and watched TV while the nurses went about their work. However, who was this Smith persona? What was the purpose of that? As he watched the local news, he thought about his life. A Robert Wilson had announced his candidacy for public office, according to the press. He pondered whether this Robert Wilson might be his sibling. A well-dressed man with a hint of gray at his temples spoke to a crowd outside a building in downtown Los Angeles while he watched. Beside him stood a pair of women, Lydia and a teenage girl who resembled an adult Jenny. "I promise the people of this great state that I'll bring ethics and accountability back into our state government," Robert said with a bit of excitement. Robert turned to face Lydia and planted a kiss on her cheek, saying, "Sacramento is out of control, and we need to get back to basics." He believed she had the best looks money could buy, and she was 2 years younger than Avery. The news anchor said, displaying an image of Wilson in his police uniform, "Wilson, who was joined by his wife and daughter, made his announcement this afternoon and is already ahead in the polls." Since the tragic shooting death of his brother Avery in 2009, Wilson has worked with the families of fallen police officers. As he watched the report, the man thought, "What the hell?" He thought to himself, "Death? I'm not dead." He put his head back and tried to recall the last few days before he ended up in the hospital, but his memory kept going blank. "And what's this about Jenny being Robert's daughter?" he asked. In an attempt to find a solution, his thoughts drifted back to the significant occasions in his life. His older brother Robert crossed his mind. Robert had been the source of his misery for as long as he could remember. In addition to being a bully, he also took great pleasure in robbing his younger brother of everything, including money, credit for his accomplishments, belongings, and even relationships. Robert seemed to want everything that Avery possessed, regardless of whether he actually needed it or not. Even worse, their parents supported everything Robert said and did. If Robert did something wrong, he always made sure their parents punished the younger sibling. Avery hated his older brother growing up, and it wasn't helped by the abuse he endured from his parents. Avery was the black sheep, while Robert was the good son who would go on to achieve success. Avery never told his family he had enlisted because it was so horrible. Having recently graduated from high school, he was heading to boot camp the following day. One day after school let out, he had completed all the physicals and signed the enlistment papers, so he was ready to go. Before he was compelled to make a call home, no one even knew where he was. When he called, his father yelled, "You did what?" You get your bum back home right now, young man. Avery never forgot that day. He saw them standing in formation, and after the speeches, they stood to receive their certificates, and he saw them, including Robert, watching. I'm over 18, and I'm already in boot camp, and there's not a goddamn thing you can do about it, Avery said, and with that, he slammed the phone down, ending the call. He kept his word and never spoke with any of them until he graduated from the police academy in 1997. That wasn't his decision, by the way. They learned from the lap that he would be graduating and showed up to see him. When they blocked his way after the ceremony, he made every effort to flee, but they did not appear to be very happy. You're not getting away from us again, Avery, his father remarked. I knew you'd finally make something of yourself. Robert grinned, but the smile vanished fast. I had hoped you would have gone to college to be a lawyer like your brother and me, he said. Yeah, well, this is my choice, and it's something you can't take from me, Avery replied, looking at Robert. And for your information, I did make something of myself in the army. Please, Avery. We haven't seen or heard from you in 7 years, his mother Barbara pleaded. Please, just once, be polite to us. Maybe things would have turned out differently if you and Dad had just once given me the benefit of the doubt. It's my day, and I'll be damned if I'm going to have you screw it up for me, he said. But no, you always listened to him, always took his side in everything, and never once gave me the time of day. Avery expressed Robert's confusion. Why are you so hostile toward me? Are you serious? You were a missed reader. He pointed to his parents, who were shocked to hear him speak in this manner because he was usually so quiet and courteous. You took everything I ever had, even my girlfriends, he said. You blamed me for every shitty thing you did, and you got them to believe all of your lies, he continued. So, asshole, guess what? I've had enough of you. With hate in his eyes, he told Robert, stay out of my life, I've paid my dues and am making my own. Avery, my son, are you okay? This wasn't the same quiet man who took whatever they gave him, his mother said, shocked at her son's language. I grew up, mother, he said, turning to face his mother. I became a soldier, and you know what? She recoiled a little at that, but he went on, don't worry, mother. I've even killed men. They all deserved it since they were evil guys. I don't take crap off of people, and I'm not the same person who grew up in your house, he said, turning to face Robert. Ever, he continued, turning away from them and leaving them gaping. His family never invited him to the wedding, but he saw them at the reception when Lydia pointed them out. He met Lydia at a police event shortly after he became a police officer. She was working in the public defender's office at the time, but she was looking for a job with a major firm. He proposed a year to the day they met, and she accepted. They decided to have a long engagement to make sure things would work out and got married a year later. That's your family, right? Pointing to Robert and his parents, she questioned. Yeah, he replied. I don't know why they're here. She pleaded, you have to introduce me. They grinned as Avery introduced his wife, and he gave in and walked his bride over to them. Avery's father remarked, well, it's great to finally meet you. Why didn't we receive an invitation to your wedding, Avery? His mother inquired. In actuality, he never invited them, so Avery claimed, must have been an oversight or something. Dan looked at Avery, who appeared shocked to hear that he would soon be joining our firm. Oh, I'm sorry, Avery, didn't you know? She was only accepted by the board today. Avery said, no, I didn't know, while Robert grinned. Avery, I apologize. It was only recently that I realized I had been accepted, Lydia remarked. That's okay, dear, Avery said, nodding his head. We'll talk about it later. Are you okay with me dancing with my new sister-in-law? Robert smiled broadly and asked. Listen up, asshole, Avery told his older brother, pulling him aside to speak in a low voice so no one else could hear. This isn't high school. She's not some schoolgirl, she's my wife. I comprehend, Robert said in a patronizing manner. Grabbing his shoulder, Avery said, no, you don't. Are you aware of my military activities? No, I assume you were some kind of clerk or something. Robert shook his head. No, I was a marksman. I can blow your balls off from 1,000 yards away, and I made my living killing scumpsuckers just like you. Recognize? Robert's smile vanished, and he turned to face his younger brother in disbelief. Is that a threat, Avery? He inquired. No, asshole, it's a goddamn promise. Avery shook his head. Avery, I understand now. Keep your hands off. Received message, Robert stated. They strolled towards Lydia and his parents. Would you please let me dance? Robert questioned in a respectful manner. Lydia turned to face Avery, who gave a nod of approval. What were you telling him? After they departed, his father inquired. After observing his wife and brother dance, Avery turned back to his father and said, You know, Robert always managed to take my girlfriends when we were in school. He was relieved to see that they maintained a polite distance from one another. I gave him a bit of sage brotherly advice, Avery said. I know, Avery, said his dad. Believe me when I tell you I didn't approve of it. Avery told him, yes, well, you never stopped it either, even when he rubbed it in my face right in front of you. This is different. She's my wife, and I sincerely hope you uphold the morality policy of your company. His father said, Look, I'm sorry about everything that's happened, but it's all in the past. I understand, Avery. Please, can't we just move past it and move on? Avery, please put your animosity toward us aside so that we can reunite as a family, his mother continued. We'll see, Mother, Avery remarked. I just asked for that, Barbara grinned. We truly love you and are very proud of everything you've accomplished, even though I know you don't believe me, she remarked. Thank you, Avery said, nodding his head and taking his mother's hug. You're right, I don't trust you, but I also secretly love you. He looked at his father and continued, There's a lot of hurt that needs to heal, and you can start by making sure he doesn't get his hooks in my wife. Son, I get it. I'll handle things directly. Avery answered, Make sure you do. Avery hoped for the best, but experience had taught him to expect the worst, and on the way to Vegas, Lydia talked to him about his relationship with his family. When his wife and brother returned, and as they left the reception for their honeymoon in Las Vegas, Avery turned to see Robert and his father discussing something quietly while looking at them. He even asked me to call him Bobby, saying that's what all his friends call him. You know, your brother really is a very charming man, she told me. However, you don't, and he's your sibling. Why? Avery told her about his upbringing, how his brother had stolen everything from him, including his relationships, how his parents had always supported Robert over him, and how he had been grounded and spanked for things his brother had done. So when the time came to leave, I did, he explained. I put it all behind me and built my own life. Oh my God, I had no idea. They made no mention of you whatsoever. To be honest, I never would have applied to their firm if I had known any of this. Don't worry, it's only a warning, Avery reassured her. Be careful with Robert. Yes, his charm is merely a means to an end. He is trouble. I've witnessed it far too frequently, so believe me. You can trust me, sweetie, she replied. I'll never do anything to hurt you, ever. He trusted her, but he also lived by the maxim trust but verify. He observed what she wore to work, the occasions when she had to stay late at work, her general manner, and so on. 2 years after their marriage, Jenny was born. She was his little girl, someone he could always rely on to make him happy, and Lydia proved to be an excellent mother as well. During the first few years, his wife showed no signs of trouble, not even at the firm's various parties and events. He even began to warm up to his parents a little and allowed them to spend time with their granddaughter. Nevertheless, he continued to monitor her, and if something was amiss, they were adept at hiding it. At a police seminar in San Diego in November 2008, Avery met Ben Jacobs, an all-around master of all trades who was into everything from financial planning to private investigations, you name it. The two hit it off, especially since Ben was also an Army veteran, and they became fast friends, feeling like Avery could trust the man with his life. That's when Avery found out about Lydia's cheating. He had purchased 2 new Apple iPhones the previous Christmas, one for himself and the other for her, with the idea that they would help the two stay in touch no matter where they were. He was returning to their Los Angeles County home when his phone rang to let him know he had a message, and when he looked at the screen, he was taken aback by what he saw. Had a great time tonight, lover. See you tomorrow, it said. He made sure the text originated from Lydia's phone and put it away. He wasn't sure who the lover was, but he assumed it was Robert because he didn't know who else she might see the following day, and he knew they frequently collaborated on cases and projects. He had to come up with a plan before he got home, so he pulled off the freeway in Orange County and called Ben. "Hey, Avery, what's up?" Ben asked. "Ben, I got a strange message on my phone, and I need some help. Think you could work as my PI for a little while?" he asked. "Sure, but it'll cost you," Ben said. "Yeah, okay." He explained what had happened, and Ben said he would start looking into it. "In the meantime, don't do anything stupid," Ben said. "Don't go blowing your brother's balls off, you hear me?" "Yeah, I hear you. Give me some time. It might take me a bit to get some evidence you can use against them, especially since they've been so careful up until now," Ben told him. "Okay, stay in touch," Avery replied. "Will do," Ben said, ending the call. How could she? Avery asked himself. He fought back the tears, but lost. Even now, he teared up thinking about that day. The nurse's voice brought him back to the present day. "Are you all right, Mr. Smith?" the nurse asked. He suddenly realized he was crying and wiped his eyes. "Yeah," he croaked through parched lips. "Can I get something to drink?" "Sure, Mr. Smith." "I'll be right back," she said, walking to the nurse's station. She came back a moment later with a cup of ice water. As he sipped on the water, the doctor came into the room. "Well, good news, Mr. Smith," he said. "All of your tests came back good, so we're going to get that feeding tube out of you and get you up to your room." A couple of nurses came into the room and began working on him. Soon he was being transported to a private room where he actually got to eat real food for the first time in a decade. He watched the news as he ate, and when he was finished, he heard a knock on the door. "Come in," he said, his voice still weak. "Johnny boy, how are you doing?" the man said as he came inside. Avery looked at him and didn't recognize him at first. "It's me, Ben, remember?" "Yeah, I was just thinking about you," he said. Ben sat down next to Avery's bed and pulled up a briefcase after closing the door. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he opened the case. Avery nodded his head. "Weak but getting stronger." "Tell me, Ben, what the hell happened? Why does everyone keep calling me Mr. Smith, and why did you call me Johnny?" "That's because Avery Wilson died 10 years ago," Ben said. Avery, or John, looked at him shocked. "What? How?" he asked. "But I'm still alive." Ben shook his head. "No, Avery is dead. Your name is John Smith." According to the official record, Avery was killed during a home invasion that took place when he went back to get some things out of his house. "How much do you remember?" The man shook his head, then pulled out a laptop and set it up in front of him. "Watch this," he said, bringing up a video. The video showed his wife, Robert, and Dan in a hotel room. Lydia was having sex with Dan and Robert. After their climax, they sat on the bed and sipped their drinks. "Avery will be coming over tomorrow to get the rest of his things," Dan said. "Good," Robert said. "We can take care of him then." He looked at Robert. "Think you have the balls to blow your own brother away?" Robert laughed. "Seriously?" he asked. "Hell yes. I've been wanting to do that scum sucker in for a long time." Dan and Lydia smiled. "See that you do," Dan said. "Make it look like a home invasion, and for crying out loud, clean yourself up good and don't leave anything behind." "I got it under control," Robert said. John sat shocked at hearing his family plot to murder him. Ben brought up another video. This video showed Avery tied to a chair as Robert and Lydia were on the bed, naked, having sex. After they finished, they sat on the bed and looked at Avery, who was shaking his head. He tried to cry out but was gagged and couldn't say anything. Robert grabbed a shotgun and pointed it at Avery as Lydia laughed. "Well, well, look here," he said in the video. "The stupid cuck is waking up finally. Wakey, wakey." As Avery focused on the scene before him, he began struggling. "Don't waste your time, little brother. What do you think? I've taken your wife in your bed right in front of you. Your daughter is really mine, and now I'm going to take your life," he said as Lydia laughed. He pointed the shotgun and fired once, knocking Avery in the chair over. "Is he dead?" Lydia asked. "Please tell me you killed him." Robert walked over to Avery and prodded the body with the shotgun. Getting no response, he put the shotgun down. "Help me get him out of this chair," he told Lydia. "It has to look like he was shot by a burglar." Lydia got off the bed and joined Robert, and the two of them took Avery out of the chair, arranging his body so it looked as though he was surprised and shot by an intruder. They took a shower, changed clothes, and left. The video ended but picked up later when Avery's body was put on a gurney by paramedics. As they watched, Lydia and Robert were heard crying in the background. "So you had video of Robert shooting me but did nothing with it?" John asked. "I had no choice," Ben said. "The feds told me to bury it. It seems your father and brother were under investigation for work they've been doing with some rather shady characters." "Organized crime?" John asked. Ben nodded his head. "Among other things," he said. "Hell, who do you think is bankrolling your brother's run for the state senate?" "So how did I survive?" John asked. "Apparently, someone upstairs really likes you," Ben said. "There was a lot of damage, but fortunately, Robert is a much better lawyer than Shooter. It was a bit of a medical miracle that you survived at all. If you hadn't gone into a coma, the feds would have had you under witness protection. As it was, they were able to make it look as though you had died. They even got hold of a body that looked a lot like you for the funeral." "Was Lydia there?" John asked. Ben laughed as he nodded his head. "Oh yeah, she played the grieving widow role to the hilt," Ben said. John laughed. "What about Jennifer?" he asked. "She'll be going to college soon. She's missed you a lot and blames her mother for what happened. She's quite resourceful. You'd be real proud of her." "So who's been paying for all this?" John asked. "Well, you remember that lottery ticket you won?" he asked. John nodded his head. "You trusted me with it, if you recall. So I made some investments and put it all in an offshore account. It's grown quite a bit, and that's what's been paying for your hospital stay. There's enough in that account to take care of you for the rest of your life if you're careful." "Thank you for that," John said. "My pleasure. So, what do you see happening from here on?" Ben asked. "I'd like to see my daughter," John said, "and I need to get revenge on the a-holes who did this to me. All of them." Ben nodded his head. "I understand," he said. "I had a feeling you might say that." They talked for a while longer and discussed their plans for the future, which included revenge on Lydia, Robert, and Avery's parents. John even considered putting his sniper skills to use against them, but Ben talked him out of that. "Wouldn't you rather see them suffer for a while first?" Ben asked, a wicked smile coming over his face. "What do you have in mind?" John asked, his mood improving considerably as Ben laid out a potential plan. By the time Ben left, John was in a great mood. He even embraced his new identity with a vengeance. Oh yes, he thought to himself. They would all pay for what they had done to him. He spent the next few days in the hospital getting stronger with each passing day. His mind went over the events that led to his shooting. He thought back to the final days of his previous life. December 2008. After Avery received the text message from Lydia, he authorized Ben to set up hidden cameras and microphones in his house. Ben went all out and even put hidden microphones in his wife's car. Avery had no idea where the devices were, which he surmised was probably a good thing. Ben somehow managed to get hidden cameras set up in their offices. Avery didn't know how his friend managed that and didn't ask. 2 weeks after getting the text, he received an email from his friend to come by his office. "Hey, Avery," Ben said as he walked in and shook hands. "Are you ready for this?" Avery shook his head. "I don't know," he said. Ben nodded in understanding. "It's not pretty." He held out a large packet of photos that showed Lydia and Robert in a variety of compromising positions. From what he could tell, all of their trysts took place either in a hotel room or their office. Some of the photos showed Lydia with both Robert and his father, Dan, at the same time. One photo showed his mother, Barbara, was also involved. It took everything he had to keep from getting sick. "There's more," Ben said, starting a video on his computer. As Avery watched, Lydia was blowing his father's tool. He recognized his father's office. Once they finished, Dan poured them a drink and they settled into their seats, still naked. "You know, we've been very careful to keep all this from Avery, but you know he's going to figure it out pretty soon," Lydia said. "He may be a Boy Scout, but he's not stupid." Robert and his father laughed. "Please," Robert said condescendingly. "We've been doing this for what, 5 or 6 years? He still hasn't figured it out yet. We could probably screw right in front of him and he wouldn't know what's going on. Maybe we should fill him in this Christmas," he said. "How about this, after dinner this Christmas, we slip him a little something and let him watch. We'll give him a little incentive, and if he doesn't go along with the program, then we revert to Plan B." "Plan B?" Lydia asked. "You mean let our friends from back east take him out?" "Something like that," Dan said. "Your husband isn't the only sniper out there, you know." Lydia laughed. "You think Barb will go along with that?" Lydia asked. "Who do you think came up with the idea?" Dan said. Lydia lifted her glass. "Well then, here's to Barb and Christmas dinner," she said, smiling. The two men joined her. Avery felt even sicker after the video ended. "My God," he said. "They're all in on it. Even my mother." "Avery, you need to be very careful going forward," Ben said. "There are other videos in here as well, and they're all just as bad. So far, they've been very careful. From what I've been able to determine, they've only been getting together about once a week or so until just the last few months." Ben pulled out a business card. "I've taken the liberty of setting you up with the meanest divorce lawyer in the area. I've already given her the evidence I've shown you," he said. "Use my phone and set up an appointment. She's waiting to hear from you." Avery called and arranged to see the attorney that afternoon. "What about their plot to take me out?" Avery asked. "I've provided that info to the FBI," Ben said, "but I'm not convinced anything's going to come from it. Right now, it's just talk. There's no evidence to suggest anything has actually been arranged. The bottom line, Avery, is that you need to be very careful. Act normally if you can. I know it's going to be hard, but you have to protect yourself. Anyway, keep in touch, and I'll let you know if I get anything else." Avery thanked his friend and headed out to see his attorney. He made it to the office of Sally McIntosh, his attorney. The receptionist ushered him in after he introduced himself. "Good afternoon, Officer Wilson," Sally said, shaking his hand. "Please call me Avery, Ms. McIntosh," he said. "Only if you call me Sally," she said in response. She pulled out a large folder and got right to business. Avery was impressed. "I already spoke with Ben, and he provided me with the evidence he collected. I must tell you, this is probably the most messed up situation I've ever seen in my career." "So what are you expecting out of this?" Sally asked. "Well, I'd like custody of my daughter if she really is mine, and I don't want to give her any support. I'd also like to go after Robert and my ex-parents," he said. Sally nodded her head. You know that California is a no-fault state as far as divorce is concerned, she said. We can file under irreconcilable differences and use the evidence as a bargaining chip in the division of property. As for custody, I'm afraid you're going to be on the short end of the stick there, as most judges here give custody to the mother. There's a chance that given your wife's earnings, you might be able to get away without having to give her support. We can make that argument and see what the judge says. What about Robert and the rest of my family? He asked. Unfortunately, California law doesn't allow for lawsuits citing alienation of affection. We might be able to find other grounds for a lawsuit, but I'm not too sure anything will come of it, she replied. All right, Avery said. Do what needs to be done. When would you like to have her served? Sally asked. Avery thought for a moment. Christmas Day, he said. At my parents' house. Sally laughed. You're cold-blooded, she said. Divorce for Christmas. I like it. Given what I've seen, I'll also throw in an order of protection keeping her and your family as far away from you as possible. Thanks, Avery said. I'm really sorry about all this, Avery. You seem like a good man, Sally said, ending the meeting. Avery drove home in a fog, processing everything he had seen and heard. Never in his life would he have thought that his entire family would conspire against him like this. Lydia sensed that something was wrong and tried to approach him. What's wrong, dear? She asked. Avery shook his head in disbelief. I just have a lot on my mind, he said. One of my friends found out his wife is cheating on him. He's really taking it very hard. I'm sorry to hear that, she said. I'd never do that to you. Yeah, right, he thought. You know that, don't you? He looked at her before shaking his head. I hope to God you never do, he said in a monotone. Lydia wasn't sure how to take this. Does he really know? She asked herself. He stayed in his study after she left and looked at the evidence Ben gave him. He shook his head in disbelief. Are you coming to bed? Lydia asked. Avery shook his head and waved her off. I've got a lot on my mind. You go on up, he said. He ended up sleeping on the couch in his study. Lydia woke him up the next morning. Why didn't you come to bed last night? She asked. I was looking forward to some loving. He looked at her in disbelief. I was just going through some things, he said. Well, you know we have our company Christmas party tonight, right? She asked. He nodded his head. I'll expect you at the office around 4:30 this afternoon, and I hope your mood improves before then. Yeah, sure, he said. She bent down to kiss him and hit his cheek as he turned his head. Love you, she said as she walked out. Yeah, me too, he said half-heartedly. Does he know? She asked herself as she walked out. That afternoon, Avery went to his wife's Christmas party, which was always held at the office where she worked. Robert met him as he walked in. Well, look who the cat dragged in, he said, his speech slurred from alcohol. Avery shook off the offer of a drink and grabbed a bottle of water. What, you're too good to drink with us now? Robert asked. I'm still on duty, Avery said. And I hope you're not planning to drive tonight. What, is little brother going to arrest me? Robert slurred. Only if you break the law, Avery said. Lydia and his father came up to him. Lydia went to kiss him, but he turned his head. Avery's threatening to arrest me, Robert said. Can you believe that? Dan looked at him. I'd probably arrest you too, after all you've had to drink, Dan said. He reached out to shake Avery's hand. Good to see you, son. Come on in and join the party. Avery kept his hand on his sidearm and followed his father and wife. Lydia wrapped her arm around her husband's. Relax, she said. You look like you're expecting someone to attack you. Avery looked at his wife. Police in uniform are always targets, you know that, he said. He took in his surroundings and noticed the looks of pity he received. A few of Lydia's co-workers shook his hand and thanked him for his service, but he saw it in their eyes. They knew. All of them. After a while, he excused himself and went to the men's room. Robert was there washing his hands. Avery saw the large diamond-encrusted Rolex on his arm. "Nice watch," Avery said. "Is that new?" Robert took it off and handed it to Avery. "Yeah," he said. "It was a gift." Avery looked at it and turned it over. "Merry Christmas with all our love, your two girls, Lydia and Jenny," the inscription said. Avery handed the watch back, taking in the smirk on Robert's face. "Nice," Avery said as he finished. He washed his hands and left before Robert could say anything. He caught up with Lydia and his father as they were talking to someone. "I have to go," he said. "Something has come up and I need to deal with it." Lydia turned to kiss him, but he left before she could say or do anything. He didn't look back. At that point, he didn't care. After his shift ended, he went to a bar and nursed a couple of beers before heading home. Why did she do it, he asked himself. Lydia was home by the time he got there, and she was pissed. "Where were you?" she asked. "I finished my shift and went for a couple of beers," he said. "What do you care anyway?" "I care," she said. "You're my husband and I love you." "How much did Robert's Rolex cost you?" he asked. Lydia's eyes grew wide. "You saw that?" she asked. "Yeah, I saw it, and I saw what you had inscribed. Your two girls." "Seriously, is Jenny his daughter?" "Tell me, wife," he said. "He's her uncle and my brother-in-law, that's all," she said. "Really? Please don't insult my intelligence. I saw the looks everyone at your office gave me. I'm not stupid." "It's not what you think," she said. "Yeah, right. Sorry, I don't believe you," he said. "Look, you've been asking what I want for Christmas. Right now, all I want is your signature." "My signature?" she asked. "On what?" "On the divorce papers," he said. "Divorce?" she asked. "I don't want a divorce. I love you. You're my husband." "Sure you do," he said. "When you spread your legs for another man, that's exactly what you're saying. I know a lot more than you may think, so don't lie to me. I just want to know two things." "What?" she asked. "Why, and how long," he said. Lydia's eyes fell to the floor. "It's been going on since a few months after I started with the firm," she said. "You mean this has been going on for most of our marriage?" he asked. She nodded her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't want to hurt you. It was only sex, and Robert. You got off on it, didn't you? Remember anything I told you about Robert?" Avery asked. "Did I ever give you any indication that I would enjoy being cuckolded?" "I'm sorry," she said. "He was just so slick and charming. I did everything I could to keep you from finding out." "When did my father get in on the action?" he asked. Lydia's eyes grew wide. "How did you know?" she asked. "It doesn't matter how." "How long have you been screwing my father?" he asked. "That started about a year ago," she said. "We were all very careful. We really didn't want to hurt you." "Am I Jenny's father?" he asked. "Of course you are," she said. "You'll forgive me if I don't believe you," Avery responded. "I'll have DNA tests done to find out for sure." "How dare you?" she began before Avery exploded. "No," he said. "How dare you? You know how much I hated that scum sucker, but you just had to go and screw him anyway." "And my father?" "No, all of this is on you. And yes, I'm filing for divorce. All these years I've loved you and you alone. I'm the one who took care of you when you were sick, and I'm the one who took care of Jenny because you were too busy. You were my life, and you stabbed me in the back. Now leave me alone. I'll try not to screw up the holiday for Jenny, but you and your affair partner better not screw with me." He grabbed a few things and set up house in his office. He avoided his wife as much as he could and said nothing to her. He spent as much time as he could with his daughter, knowing that soon he would become a part-time father. Ben contacted him later, telling him he had some new video. "Looks like you really stirred up a hornet's nest," Ben said as Avery walked into the office. Ben started the latest video as Avery sat down. The video came from his father's office. As usual, the three lovers were naked, engaging in their usual activity. "He knows," Lydia said. Robert and Dan shrugged their shoulders. "So what?" Robert said. "Doesn't change anything." "He's filed for divorce," Lydia said. "Have you been served yet?" Dan asked. Lydia shook her head. "Not yet, but I expect it'll happen soon," she said. "Well, I guess we'll just have to educate your husband. Let him know the deal. He can either go along or get royally screwed," Dan said. "Just be careful," Lydia said. "Don't worry. He's just a stupid cop. He can't do anything to us," Robert said. Avery sat quietly as the video ended. "Be very careful," Ben said. "I've already forwarded this to Sally, and I've spoken with your supervisor. He tells me he'll have patrols out keeping an eye on things." Ben handed him a key to an apartment he had arranged for Avery to stay at for a while. Avery thanked him before heading out. On Christmas morning, Lydia asked if he was going to his parents' house. "Yeah, I'll be there," he said. She bent down to kiss him, but he waved her off. "Save it for your lovers," he said. "Please don't screw up Christmas," she said as she walked out with Jenny. "You mean any more than you've already screwed it up?" he asked. "Go on, get out of here. I'll be along shortly." After he saw Lydia leave, he put his uniform on, making sure he had his body armor. He already had most of his clothes and personal items packed and in his car. He called the process server to verify the time he would be at the Wilson residence and arranged to meet him there. Then he called his shift supervisor to have a patrol car standing by. He timed his arrival carefully and met the process server a block away. The man got into his car, and he pulled up in front of the house. They got out, and Avery rang the bell. Avery's father answered the door and looked shocked when he saw his son and another man. "What's the meaning of this, Avery?" he asked. "You don't need to ring the bell. We've all been wondering when you were going to get here." "Please, Mr. Wilson," Avery said in his best cop voice, his hand on his sidearm. "I'm here on official business." "Is Lydia Wilson here?" "Yes, she is." "You know that." "Please come in," Dan said. Avery shook his head. "Not today, Mr. Wilson." "Have Mrs. Wilson come to the door, please," Avery said. Dan nodded his head and motioned for Lydia, who showed up with Jenny. The process server addressed her. "Mrs. Lydia Wilson?" he asked. She nodded her head as he verified her identity and handed her the envelope. "You've been served," Lydia began crying as she opened the envelope. "You're serving me with divorce papers on Christmas?" she asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How could you?" "That's a lot better than what you and my former family had planned for me, I think," Avery said. Jenny started crying as she watched her mother and looked up at her father. He knelt down and hugged his daughter. "What's going on, Daddy?" she asked. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but your mother has decided she doesn't love me anymore," he said, holding her as she cried. "I'll see you as soon as I can and never forget that I love you, okay?" Jenny, crying, turned to her mother and kicked her in the shins. "I hate you," she cried as she ran away. Dan pushed his way beside a wailing Lydia. "How dare you come here and disrupt our family Christmas?" he bellowed. "Mr. Wilson, consider yourself fortunate that I'm not going to arrest you and the rest of your family for conspiracy," Avery said, handing him another envelope that contained pictures and video from their tryst at the Marriott. He was very careful not to include anything that was recorded in their offices. By now, Barbara and Robert had come to the door. "What's going on?" Barbara asked. "Avery just served Lydia with divorce papers," Dan said. "He knows." Barbara stepped back, her face turning white. "Yes, and I know all about what the four of you had planned for me," Avery said. "I suggest you look very carefully at the protection order and follow it to the letter. I will have no problem arresting you if you violate it." "Protection order?" Robert shouted. "Why, I ought to kick your bum right now," he added, reaching out to Avery. Dan intercepted him as Avery prepared to pull his sidearm. "Don't touch him, stupid!" Dan yelled. Robert pulled his hand back. Dan looked at Avery. "Okay, a-hole, if that's the way you want to play it. You could have been part of something great, but you blew it," he said. "I thought I was part of something great," Avery said. He looked at Lydia. "I'll call you after the first and schedule a time when I can get the rest of my things. In the meantime, I suggest you obey the order and stay away from me." "Okay," she said. "I am sorry." "Yeah," Avery said. "Goodbye. Merry Christmas." Avery went to the apartment Ben had set up for him and unpacked. "Merry Christmas indeed," he muttered, spending the rest of the day drowning his sorrows in a bottle of Jack Daniels. The next week, he received a call from his father. "I want to see you in my office this afternoon," Dan ordered. Avery laughed. "People in hell want ice water too." "Ain't going to happen." "Have you forgotten about the order of protection? If you want to meet, you can call my attorney and arrange a meeting at her office with her present." He ended the call before Dan could say anything else and contacted Sally. She wasn't thrilled that he called during her holiday time off, but listened to what Avery said and agreed to meet with Dan, Robert, and Lydia in her office. She also agreed to contact Dan and set it up. That afternoon, the five of them met in a conference room at Sally's office. "Couldn't this have waited until after the new year?" Sally asked. "No, it couldn't," Dan said. "Are you Mrs. Wilson's attorney?" Sally asked. Dan looked at Robert. "Robert Wilson and I are both her attorneys," he said. "I guess you really don't care about things like conflict of interest, do you?" Sally asked. "Well, we'll see what the state bar has to say about that. What's so important that you just had to meet with my client during the holiday?" Dan pulled a folder out of his briefcase and set it on the table. "I want Avery to call off this stupid divorce and sign this agreement," he said. Sally read the paper inside and laughed. She handed the paper to Avery, who also read it, not believing what he was seeing. "You honestly expect my client to sign away his rights as a husband and agree to let his wife have sex with you and his brother? Mr. Wilson, you're out of your mind, and rest assured I am going to take this before the state bar. Now get out of my office before I have you thrown out," she said. "I'm going to destroy you," Dan told Avery. "When I'm finished with you, you'll wish to God you'd never been born. You do know it's a violation of the law to communicate a threat against a police officer?" Sally said. "Get out before I have you all arrested." Red-faced, Dan, Lydia, and Robert left the office. Avery apologized to Sally and thanked her profusely. "I can't wait to get that a-hole in front of a judge," she said as she locked up her office. Avery kept his word and called Lydia after the new year to schedule a time to pick up the rest of his things. She told him that no one would be at the house, and he naively believed her. As soon as he entered the house, he felt a prick on his neck before everything went dark. He was still pretty groggy when he realized that he was tied up to a chair. He tried to move but couldn't and realized that tape had been placed over his mouth. He struggled but wasn't able to free himself. He heard someone say something about taking his life before he saw the brilliant flash of light. That was the last thing he remembered before waking up in the hospital. John's rehab had gone better than anyone could have imagined. Not only had he regained his memory, but his body had recovered quite well, and he now felt as strong as he ever had. He noticed that the doctors had done some reconstructive surgery on his face, apparently in an effort to deal with the scars from the shooting. It wasn't much, and it left some small scars, but it was enough to make him look considerably different than before. Ben had also provided him with special contacts intended to disguise the color of his eyes. According to Ben, his daughter had a habit of visiting his gravesite at least once a week, usually on Tuesday mornings on her way to school. John wanted to see Jenny up close and personal, and they decided it would be best if he could disguise his eye color when they finally met. They also had agreed on a plan of revenge which would be set in motion when John was released from rehab. Fortunately, today was the day. Ben arrived at the rehab center as John was getting his final instructions. He gathered his belongings and went to his friend's car. On the way to the apartment Ben had set up for him, they discussed their plan of action and agreed not to start until John had a chance to meet Jenny. Once at the complex, Ben helped his friend carry his belongings upstairs. John looked around at the one-bedroom apartment, impressed with the furniture Ben had picked out for him, especially the very large flat-screen television mounted on the wall. After showing him around, Ben handed him the keys to the apartment, the keys to a brand-new SUV, and his new bank cards. John had reintroduced himself to the latest technology while in rehab and learned how to use a smartphone and the latest Windows operating system. He was able to start using the new computer Ben had set up in the front room. After thanking his friend, John settled in for the rest of the day. He took the SUV out for a spin later just to get the feel of driving. He knew that he would have to get used to driving in Southern California again, and he wasn't looking forward to that at all. He stopped at a liquor store and picked up a bottle of Jack Daniels and a pack of cigarettes. He hadn't smoked since he joined the police force, but he felt the old urge and figured that since he was already technically dead, it didn't matter anymore. He got back home and rested for the day, watching some television. After relaxing with a glass of JD and a cigarette, he went to bed for the night. He woke up early the next day, showered, dressed, and headed out for the cemetery, hoping to get there before Jenny. He found the grave marker and took a seat to wait, nursing the cup of coffee he bought on the way. Soon, he spotted her walking down the path. He put his nearly empty cup in the trash bin and got up. She stopped at the grave and seemed to be saying something when he stepped up next to her. She looked at him before speaking. "Did you know my father?" she asked. He nodded his head before speaking. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I did. We were in the army together," John said. He extended his hand. "Smith." "John Smith," he said. Jenny took his hand and looked at him carefully. "Jenny Wilson." "Good to meet you, Mr. Smith." "John Smith," he smiled. "Please, call me John," he said. She smiled before turning back to the grave marker. "He was a hero, you know," she said. "Served on the police force also." Tears came to her eyes as she spoke. "You really miss your father, don't you?" he asked. She nodded her head. "I haven't seen him since I was 8 years old," she said. "I miss him so much. I like to come here early in the morning and say hello. My mother would kill me if she knew." "Really?" John asked. "Yeah," she said. "She married my uncle after my dad was killed. My dad had just filed for divorce. He was killed shortly afterward." "Do you know how it happened?" John asked. "Supposedly he was shot by a burglar," she said. "I take it you don't believe that," John said. She shook her head. "My dad was the best cop there was. I don't believe he was caught by surprise," she said. "I can't prove otherwise though." "What do you think happened?" John asked. "I don't know," she said. "I just can't believe a burglar caught him by surprise." John nodded his head. "It happens, you know," he said. "Yeah, but not to my dad," Jenny said. "So, if you don't mind my asking, have you decided what you want to do with your life?" John asked. "I don't mind, John," she said. "I plan on going to UCLA this fall. I want to be a lawyer, but not like my mother or my uncle. I want to be a prosecutor. I want to put bad guys away. I think I owe it to my dad." "Your dad would be very proud of you," John said, tears coming to his eyes. He wanted so much to wrap his arms around this girl and tell her it was going to be okay and that he was proud of her. She looked at him for a while before speaking. "I have to get going now, John. Would you mind if we stayed in touch? I don't know why, but I feel safe with you even though we just met. Something about you reminds me of my dad, she said. John smiled. Sure, Jenny. May I give you my number? Please feel free to call me anytime you need to. Sure, she said, smiling. I hope you don't mind if I call at odd hours. He shook his head. Not at all, Jenny. Call me anytime you want. They exchanged numbers, and Jenny left. He headed for his SUV and didn't see Jenny put his discarded coffee cup in a plastic bag. He also didn't see her write down the number on his license plate. John left the cemetery and headed for Griffith Park Observatory. It was time to put the plan in motion. Once he got there, he looked out over the city, a place where he once served as a police officer. He pulled out 2 of the burner phones Ben had purchased. He activated the first one, set the number to private, and connected the voice changer device Ben gave him. He selected the effect he wanted, then dialed a number. A woman answered on the second ring. He recognized the voice as belonging to Lydia. Lydia Wilson, she said abruptly. Why? Why did you kill me? He asked before hanging up. He quickly turned the phone off and removed the battery. Unknown to him, Lydia had just left a meeting with some of her husband's backers when the call came in. She heard the message and tried to respond, but the call had already ended. She thought it sounded like her deceased husband Avery, but she couldn't be sure. Surely Avery wasn't calling me from the grave, she said to herself. She thought about returning the call until she realized the incoming number was set to private. She knew her current husband had enemies and wondered if the call came from one of them. John, meanwhile, had activated the second phone. This time, he used it to send a text message to Robert's phone with an attached picture. The caption read, "Remember my promise," and the photo was one recently taken of Robert just outside his office, with a set of crosshairs over his groin. After he confirmed the message was sent, he turned off the phone and removed the battery. Both phones were later smashed, with the pieces dropped in various trash bins around the area. Robert, of course, saw the photo and read the caption. He knew it referred to the promise Avery had made to him on his wedding day so long ago, but this was impossible, he thought. Avery had been dead for 10 years, and no one, not even Lydia, knew what his younger brother had told him. Things were tense in the Wilson household that night. Robert and Lydia shared their experience with each other but chalked it up to a political enemy and thought no more about it. John followed the plan he and Ben had agreed to and waited 3 days before making his second round of calls. This time he traveled to nearby Orange County before sending a screenshot of the video showing Robert shooting him to Lydia. The message caption simply read, "Your sins will find you out." The call to Robert's phone was also different this time. He whispered, "Remember, I can blow your balls off from 1,000 yards away," he said, before destroying both phones and placing the pieces in different trash bins. After that, he hung up. Robert and Lydia were becoming increasingly anxious because no one except them and Avery knew about what happened in that bedroom a decade ago. How could this be happening? They asked each other, following the plan that John and Ben had laid out. For a couple of days, no one called or texted. John, knowing that Ben was busy gathering information about Robert, spent his free time reading about what had happened over the past decade. Then, he received a call. Opening his smartphone, he saw that it was from Jenny, John Smith's daughter. He answered, "Hi John, this is Jenny. Remember me?" with a smile, remembering that he would never forget his little girl. He said, "What can I do for you?" "Can we meet tomorrow morning at my dad's grave about 6 a.m., she asked. "Of course, I'll be there. Is everything all right?" "I need to talk to someone really bad," she said. "Okay, I'll see you there in the morning," he told her. "Thanks," she said before hanging up. He wondered what it was she needed to talk to him about. The next day, he sat at the bench near the gravesite and waited for Jenny. She arrived right on time and sat next to him. "Good morning," he said. She returned the greeting. He could tell she was very nervous about something. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. She looked at the grave, then back at him. She opened her purse, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked. "You know, I remember the last time I ever saw my dad alive," she said. "After the funeral, my mother married my uncle Robert, and he insisted I call him Dad. I refused, even though it made my mother mad. He kept telling me that he was my father, but I didn't believe him. Now I have the truth. Hek, not my real dad." She looked at his face. John was shocked. How could she know, he wondered. She pointed to the envelope. "I'm sorry for the intrusion, but after we met, I grabbed your coffee cup and your cigarette but from the trash. You know, those things will kill you," she said. He laughed. "Something about you reminded me of that day 10 years ago. You know, you can wear contacts to change the color of your eyes, get facial surgery to change your hair color, even mess up your fingerprints. But you can't change your DNA. They were able to get enough saliva off what I found that they were able to identify you as my father with 99.9% certainty." "Wow," John said. "Ben was right about you. You were resourceful. You're going to make a hell of a prosecuting attorney someday." Jenny smiled. "So who are you really, and who's buried in my father's grave if it isn't you?" she asked. "The man you knew as Avery Wilson died 10 years ago," he said. "My name really is John Smith. You can thank the feds for that. The official story is that Avery was killed during a home invasion, but that's not the truth, is it?" she asked. He shook his head. "No," he said, "not even close." "I knew it," she said. "I want the truth, Dad," she said. Although he enjoyed it when she referred to him as Dad. He was concerned that she might not be able to cope with the full truth. "Are you really sure about that?" he asked, looking into her eyes, and she responded, "Yes, I need to know." Despite the fact that things were not going well at the Wilson household, he assumed JN had said. Jenny shook her head in disagreement and said that Robert and Mom have been on edge for the past few days due to some strange calls and texts. This has really upset them, but there's more, isn't there? At this point, John embraced Jenny, who had been trying to hold back her tears, because he wanted to comfort her and because it felt good to hold his girl again. She spoke softly before continuing, "Robert has been molesting me." John felt a surge of anger as she spoke, asking how long it had been going on. She called him the scum sucker. John shook his head and said, "I could never hate you. You're my little princess and always will be." She loved hearing him say that. After JN asked if she had called 911, she nodded a few times. "They sent someone to check on me, but my mom denied it. After that, they beat me and locked me in my room, threatening to harm me if I told anyone else." "What do you have planned for today?" John asked. "Nothing really. School is out, but I can't stand to be around the house anymore." She said, "These days, I'm just waiting to graduate so I can move out and go to college." "You said you wanted to see proof. How about we meet up at my place so I can show you?"